We are bringing them home. The triumphant words of US President Joe Biden today after successfully pulling off a massive prisoner swap with Russia. Now, this was a complex deal that involved secret negotiations in several countries, including Germany, each of whom admitted that the exchange required some tough decisions. Now, this footage, released by Russia's FSB security agency, showed some of the freed prisoners being escorted onto waiting planes. Though they include high-profile American detainees, the White House says there was no direct engagement with Russian President Vladimir Putin. So what do we know about the size and scale of this deal? Well, this was the largest prisoner swap in the post-Soviet era, and it took place in Turkey. The US, Russia and others exchanged 24 prisoners and 2 children. 10 people have been moved to Russia for 16 Western and Russian nationals. Now, perhaps the most well-known of them is Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich. He was detained in Russia on spying charges in March of last year. German national Rico K., who was sentenced to death in Belarus on terrorism charges, is also among those freed, as is Vadim Krasikov, a Russian who was convicted of the 2019 murder of a former Chechen militant in Berlin. Well, speaking about the exchange, US President Joe Biden paid particular tribute to German leader Olaf Scholz.
I particularly owe a great sense of gratitude to the Chancellor. The demands they were making of me required me to get some significant concessions from Germany, which they originally concluded they could not do because of the person in question. But everybody stepped up. Poland stepped up, Slovenia stepped up, Turkey stepped up. And it matters to have relationships. It really does.
Well, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz said his government had found it very difficult to arrive at the decision to release Vadim Krasikov.
It was not an easy decision to deport a convicted murderer who had only served a few years in prison after he was sentenced to a life term. We had to weigh up enforcing that sentence with the dangers posed to the freedom and, in some cases, the lives of those unjustly imprisoned in Russia, and also the political prisoners held there. And that's why our obligation to protect German citizens was important to us, and also our solidarity towards the United States.
Well, let's pick up that difficult decision with Danielle Gilbert, who's Assistant Professor of Political Science at Northwestern University. Welcome to DW. Vadim Krasikov, the Russian assassin released from a German prison. He killed a Chechen in Berlin under orders from Moscow. Germany absolutely did not want to let him go back to Russia. So how do you think President Biden changed Chancellor Scholz's mind?
Well, I think this is just an example of how extremely difficult these decisions are, how complicated and frankly unfair these deals are. But at the end of the day, leaders in the United States and in Germany decided that it was worth making that painful, difficult decision to secure the freedom of prisoners who are being held unjustly in Russia. In terms of what the Biden administration did, I'm under the impression that the U.S. government was working at the highest levels behind the scenes for months, if not years, to put this kind of deal together, and both calling on the strong allies of the United States, particularly calling on Germany and the strength of that alliance, but also making sure that there were prisoners released as part of this deal that would be important to Germany as well. And so that's getting back German citizens and making sure that Russian dissidents were released as part of this deal.
And what do we make of the numbers? Is it wrong to look at the numbers in this? 10 people sent back to Russia for 16 Western and Russian nationals coming this way.
So when I look at these deals, I don't actually equate, the numbers and think of that as a way to calculate whether or not something is a good deal or a fair deal or even an interesting deal. The leaders who are engaged in this diplomacy are trying to do whatever it is they can to get the best deal they can to bring their citizens home. It's really the art of the possible. And so the thing that really stands out to me about the numbers of today's deal is just the sheer size of this deal. In recent years, the United States and Russia have engaged in one-for-one prisoner swaps. So to see 24 people being exchanged as part of this deal from 7 different countries, that's a huge amount of coordination and shows that sometimes to get a deal done, you have to put more on the table.
I'm also reading that the signs were there in Russia and Belarus for people who knew how to read them, that something was going to happen.
There were stories in recent days that suggested that this might be coming down the pike in the next couple of days. So first, there were people who were watching the travel trajectory of airplanes that had been used in hostage deals and prisoner swaps before, having unusual flight patterns. So they were watching the flight patterns of these different planes. Some lawyers who represented some of these prisoners and dissidents said that they were unable to reach their clients in recent days, which could portend really ghastly news, or could be because those prisoners were being relocated in anticipation of a deal. So there were small leaks and stories in the couple of days leading up to today that this might have been coming and possible.
And what was Turkey's role in this?
So Turkey has served as a really valuable and very interesting third-party mediator in the actual swap itself. So when these prisoner exchanges take place, they have to take place in a somewhat neutral third-party territory where airplanes from both countries can safely land and can feel comfortable allowing the prisoners to cross the tarmac so that they have these kind of simultaneous exchanges of the prisoners from one country to another. So Turkey is one of the rare countries that has working relations with both the United States and with Russia, and is able to serve as the staging ground for that swap.
Good talking to you. Thank you for talking us through that so clearly. Danielle Gilbert from Northwestern University.
Thank you for having me.
Well, Joshua Yaffa is a journalist and friend of Evan Gershkovich from his time in Moscow. Welcome to DW. How did you find out the news of his release?
Like a lot of friends and colleagues, we were frantically following the news, not just today, but for the past couple days, since murmurs of a possible exchange really started to take hold, both in Russian media, Western media, Germany. I'm here in Berlin, American media. So everyone was scrolling frantically, myself included, checking social media, looking for confirmation of the trade, checking flight maps of various planes we thought might be included, and it wasn't until we saw these pictures that you're showing now of Evan and others actually walking the tarmac in Turkey that we all collectively breathed a deep sigh of relief. The moment that we had been waiting 490 days for, the duration of Evan's detention, finally happened.
And when someone is effectively taken as a political prisoner, governments always say they're trying to sort things out in quietly in the background, and often they don't like it when friends and family and national newspapers start shouting about it. Were you getting those sorts of assurances from Washington?
Yes, secondhand. I certainly wasn't involved in any direct way in the negotiations, or the Biden administration wasn't including me or others in those negotiations, and I think for good reason, given the difficulty and sensitivity of the deal that we saw finally emerge. But Evan's parents, Ella and Mikhail, were certainly kept in the loop, and the Wall Street Journal was lobbying quite heavily, frequently, ultimately effectively for Evan's release and for the Biden administration and others to work tirelessly on Evan's behalf. So there certainly was the feeling that there was this huge apparatus, both in government and outside of government, that was keeping Evan's case a priority. The responsibility of friends and colleagues, other journalists like myself, as we saw it, was to keep attention on Evan, to have the public remember Evan, and to have that hopefully create a kind of pressure and incentive calculus for various governments to work on Evan's case. So we really thought of ourselves as using the channels and means that we know best from our own work. That is, working the media, going on shows like this one, and keeping Evan's name out in the press so his case wasn't forgotten, and that put some healthy pressure on those in government to keep working the case.
Okay, so you've been in contact with his family, and have you had any contact with Evan since he was arrested last year?
Yes, one remarkable feature of his imprisonment, despite being held in this maximum security prison in Moscow, Lefortovo, known as the kind of house prison of the FSB, the Russian security agency that's a successor to the KGB. Lefortovo, a very difficult psychologically place to be held, high sense and feeling of isolation. Nonetheless, there are letters that go in and out of Lefortovo. Myself, other friends, supporters of Evan's could write him letters. Evan could write handwritten replies. You'd get a scan of a handwritten letter sent back to you. But this worked. And in this way, I was able to keep up with Evan, tell him a bit about my life, what was happening with me, hear a bit about his life, his routine, how he passed his days, what was on his mind. And of course, he wasn't able to say everything. We couldn't discuss the case. There was lots that wasn't in those letters. But at the same time, there actually was a remarkable amount in those letters. And I feel like I and other friends and supporters of Evan's got a sense for what he was going through, even as we couldn't really imagine it. But nonetheless, we had Evan's words to help us picture it.
OK, so he and others are fortunately, thankfully, coming home. Do you think, once he's over this, I don't know, obviously I don't know what the terms of the deal are, but I wonder what your thoughts are on working in Russia from this point?
Well, Evan's arrest certainly changed the calculus overnight. A year and a half ago, when he was arrested, about what the risk calculus was, or what the risk perceived or real was for Western journalists working in Russia. And I don't think there's going back to the way things were before. That's both because of the reality in Russia, the nature of the wartime censorship laws that are on the books in Russia, and the precedent of Evan is never going away. And I think that's for the near future, as long as Putin's in power, that's a new environment for reporting from inside Russia.
Good talking to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Joshua Yaffa, journalist and friend of Evan Gershkovich.